Jam. Entertainment.
The reality is that when whites and blacks mix, the dominant gene is going to dominate, and that's the African gene. That's when you look at the different features. Even if you go now, you look into the son of Bill Clinton that's going into, he's online, everything, doing interviews. You can tell that he has the black gene in him. He doesn't look white. He looks, as we say, mixed. Because that's the reality is that when you have a black person, whether male or female, and a white person, male or female, the child, the offspring, is going to show as being black because the dominance within that genetics is going to dominate, and that will be the African gene. But historically speaking, the first enemy that we had to actually encounter in Kemet, in ancient Kemet, during the period of the 4-6 dynasties was the mulattoes first, and they were part of the Hyksos dynasty, or Hyksos. And this goes back to a book written by Chancellor Williams, Instruction in Black Civilization, that they were the first enemies that we had to encounter when we were trying to push out the invaders coming into our land of ancient Kemet, which means land of the blacks. And they were the first ones to try to slaughter our women, which was the mulattoes. They were a product of rapings that Africans encountered, African women constantly encountered after being hunted by Neanderthals who was in the caves. And so they used them as that buffer class, the first ones to try to push into ancient Kemet first, before there was any blonde hair, blue eyes that was trying to come in. And they would end up being what people would known as would be the Greeks, because they went back and mixed further with the Caucasian, blonde hair, blue eyed Neanderthals, and that actually made them tumble downward in terms of genetics. That's why if you look into the ancient Greeks and Romans, they don't look like a usual, what people would term a mulatto. They just look like curly haired Caucasians, because they went back and mixed even further. So that would actually lessen their genetics when they went back and mixed with those Greeks and those Romans. But they were actually a part of the Hyksos dynasty, the mulattoes. And so if you go even further again, you got to realize, let's go back into the Moorish period of 711 to 1492. You had what's called the Tawny Moors, and the Tawny Moors would be the mulattoes of the Blackamoors when they mixed in, when the Blackamoors, the North Africans, mixed in with the Spanish after they conquered at least 70% of Europe again. And the problem was the Tawny Moors began to war with the Blackamoors, and that began to make a problem within the rulership that the North Africans had in Europe. There was, again, the mulattoes began to resurface again with their same problem of actually warring against those that were supposed to be genetically connected to them. And that was the biggest downfall of the warring between the mulattoes against the pure Blackamoor gene. And then if you speed up now and you go into the Haitian Revolution, you got to realize the Haitian Revolution was not only started by Boukman Dada, but also Napoleon's army was coming in, and you had a group of blacks that was considered, they didn't consider themselves to be blacks. They were the mulattoes on the island, because they were a product of the mixture of the Africans that were already there, that was connected. There were the dark skinned Haitians, and then you have the what people will call the Creole, and they would be the mulattoes. They didn't consider themselves to be black or white. They came to Napoleon's group, the French, and asked, well, we're not black, we're not white, so what are we? And the French's response is, you're African and you're gonna get on that ship, or you're gonna get in that prison. And what happened was, what they decided to do before they even did that was, the problem is they did not want to connect themselves to being pure African, because they wanted to create a whole different class group. And because they want to create a whole different class group, they actually rebelled against the Haitians, that the dark-skinned Haitians that you see today, because they wanted to be a whole different racial class, the mulattoes, that were going to be against the blacks, but wanted to side with the Europeans or the French and the Americans. And then going even further now, if you go within the last 100 to 150 years, with the rise of what we would call the Boule, Sigma Pi Phi, you got to realize that group was started by a group of mulattoes who was a part of Skull and Bones of Yale. And they wanted to make a pact, and they did make a pact with the Europeans that already had a Skull and Bones society, or as we would call the Illuminati. And their group, which was known as Sigma Pi Phi, which was started back in 1904 by a man named Henry Milton, and that society was the buffer class that they wanted to create. And the perfect example of them was the Talented Tenth. The Talented Tenth, which was occupied, of course, by W.E.B. Du Bois, as well as Ida B. Wells. These were the two main mulattoes that was over the Talented Tenth. And one of the main things that they wanted to do as a boule was they wanted to gather at least a certain amount of black people, and they wanted to breed out the melanin of the blacks, because they wanted to mix in blacks with Jews, so that they can no longer have a black as two separate groups, but have one different race and rename that race. That was the first plan of actually started by Mr. Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois. And they almost succeeded, but they decided to do another plan. And that plan was started by John D. Rockefeller Jr., who funded it. And remember, his father, John D. Rockefeller Sr., was the main ones that was funding the colonization of Africa, along with the Rothschilds, under Cecil Rhodes. And the main thing that Rockefeller did was, not only did he fund the Talented Tenth and the Boule Society, but he also got Du Bois to sign off on them, not only with that, but funding all of black education from the north of America to south of America. So they funded, not only did they fund the black colleges, but they funded the high schools, the middle schools, and the elementary schools. So all of black education from 1915 up until 1965, all of the education and the schools were funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And just think, that means that not only that, also the mulattoes or the Sigma or the Boule, they were guaranteed black leadership for 40 years. They were guaranteed that because they signed off on black genocide. Because not only was John D. Rockefeller signing off on paying, because it wasn't just Rockefeller Foundation. You had the Carnegies, you had the Rosenwalds, you had the DuPonts, and you had the Rothschilds, who also put in millions and millions of dollars to make sure, because they, in their mind, they said was, we got to control the troublemakers. See, if you can control the troublemakers, then you can make sure that there will never be another Marcus Garvey. And that's the thing, is that not only did the education system within blacks get messed up, but black nationalist movements was messed up. Because if you notice, after Marcus Garvey was taken down by Du Bois and the Rockefellers, you got to realize every other black movement was no longer about liberation and back to Africa and do for self, but it was like, we're going to win in the courts. We're going to get our civil rights, and then you can no longer remember. The pact was, do not mention race. If you mention that you are African or you are black, that's when you become the enemy. And so the whole point was, if we can control your education, we can control the enemy that's within these schools, and we can control and actually educate the would-be enemy. So he or she will never be an enemy to us, because we're already controlling them mentally. And so you have the product of them. Remember, you have Boules that are, let's say, for example, the Baynard Rustins of the world. Baynard Rustin was also a man that was the first black male homosexual that had a gay lover who was a Jew, who was also connected to the Rockefeller Foundation. and he was responsible for training the man named Stokely Carmichael, as people know as Kwame Ture. But Kwame Ture was a man who basically turned his back on the Boule and the Jews, because once he came out with, you know, the Black Power information, he was betraying the training. See, they were training him to be another Boule, but he turned his back on Baynard Russin and the rest of the Jews. And so what they did was they had to go back and put more funding into Dr. King. So the big misconception about Dr. King was, oh, he was changing before he died. No, his death was a product of him going against the Vietnam War. Had nothing to do with, oh, he's a nationalist. No, he was never a nationalist. Remember, the Boule was something that he had allegiance to his whole life. The Rothschilds and Rockefellers bred him educationally, because Morehouse is funded by white money. At that time, you had white teachers, white presidents, white principals, white officials. And so he was a key Negro for, again, black containment. And as long as they can contain the blacks with black leaders who are not talking about black liberation, then they can continue to contain would-be enemies within that group. And so it's, because you got to realize in Boule you have successorship. So after Dr. King was killed, his two successors was Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton, and they took on that same responsibility that Dr. King was doing in the civil rights movement. That's what you see them continue to do to this day.